Hey everyone, welcome back and thank you for being here. So in this episode, we're going to go over the Pacific APA workshop paper that I gave. Lone Star College Montgomery provided some funding for this as well, and the Central APA, or the Pacific APA, the American Philosophical Association, um, worked actively to make sure I was able to get the right rate. So K through 12 teachers and like adjunct instructors and underemployed or underfunded instructors get a special rate with the American Philosophical Association. They get the, I think, student rate. And so that's like $65. And then Lone Star College, I mean, maybe I shouldn't say exactly how much, but you can find these numbers online. Um, and it's taxpayer money that went to this. So ultimately, I'm grateful for Lone Star College Montgomery for helping me through this process. And I guess the state of Texas as well. And then because I'm pretty sure that's where the money came from directly, but maybe it was a fund just from Lone Star College Montgomery. Um, I'm more familiar with how the process works through like Tarleton, for instance. From if it went through Tarleton, it would have to go. Tarleton State University would have to go through the Texas A&M system because they're part of the system. But since Lone Star College Montgomery has its own system, Lone Star College system, and since it's a junior college that's not a part of any of the six major um, university systems, public university systems in Texas, I'm not entirely, but I know I took like ethics courses on, um, or did training on the like ethics of what is and isn't covered by the funding, and things like on your first day of travel you should eat breakfast at home, and on your last day of travel you should have dinner at home. So, or like the specific timing, it can be particular, but everybody was really really helpful that was involved in the process. Um, and like the normal registration for like the American Float, like the meetings for the APA, can be like $300. So getting the better rate was really helpful from the APA, and then it being covered completely by Lone Star College was amazing. So um, specifically the Montgomery campus, because I think their fund for professional development is discrete from the other campuses. Um, and so again, in this video, I just want to cover kind of what that experience was like. It was a virtual conference. One of the reasons the cost was so cheap. The only funding that I needed was the registration cost, and then I attended from my home. Um, yeah, it was a workshop where we gave each other feedback on papers related to Descartes, and um, I had trouble getting access to my colleagues' files early enough because I tried to do it. I needed drive access, and somebody couldn't get me drive access in time for me. I had enough time to read the papers if I had been able to get access, but I was unaware that I needed to request access. Somebody would have to respond to it, and that could take time. So there was a major lesson learned there, obviously. The other thing I learned in preparing for the Pacific APA workshop was so the paper I submitted was 5,000 words, up to 5,000 words. For the APA, there's a deadline in like 2 days for this next central meeting. I attended the central last year, and since I'm on the road, I'm not really, and I don't have internet access, I'm not really sure if I'm going to submit anything to the central. I might, but just thinking it back, trying to remember where we were with the Pacific. Yeah, the other thing I learned is but the workshop version got to be 8,000 words. And the idea here was to develop the paper, the submission. Oh, I was going to tell you the APA in general. There's an Eastern Division, a Central Division, and a Pacific Division. They meet around the same time each year, but each division meets at a different time in the year, and they have different deadlines. So there's kind of like a trimester cycling between their submission deadlines and their events. I mean, when one division is having a submission deadline, another division is having their event. So the central meeting was in early February. The Pacific meeting was in early April. And I'm not sure when the Eastern meeting was. Maybe all the deadlines are kind of, anyway, it doesn't really matter. There's multiple submission deadlines, and there's multiple guidelines for what each division will accept. For example, I think this one required a 750 word synopsis, but the other divisions don't require or allow synopses. But the Pacific allows for rejecting a paper based on the synopsis, but then if it's accepted, it's because the full paper was read. So mine was accepted as a workshop paper, which meant that it wasn't like a finished thing. It was maybe trying to do more than it could fit, and it wasn't as clear as it could be, or it wasn't quite ready to be an article or a presentation or whatever. And the paper itself was a solution to the Cartesian circle that was trying to defend Descartes as an epistemic internalist, meaning that epistemic justification is something we have access to internally. It's not something that comes to us from externally, such as like history or family or context or things like that. But a main line of the argument is that there's a simultaneity between the mental justification, which is internal, and the experience with the world. And this really has a lot of background more in phenomenology, where there's a noetic correlate or a mental correlate to my experience of the lake right here, or to my experience of recording this session. Like every experience is with a world always. There's just a lot to unpack. The session itself went well, despite not having access to their files ahead of time. I felt like I was able to give good feedback, and they were very friendly, and they seemed open to corresponding at a later date about their work and my work. But they weren't, I mean, I think, yeah, I just wish we could have gotten better feedback if I had gotten access to the files and been able to give them my file in time. So that's the other thing I learned. What I was going to say is that there's like, I started talking about the argument itself, but one of the other things I learned is, I guess not to try to do too much with the paper. The submission, you can do a colloquium or a symposium. The colloquium is 3,000 words max. Symposium is 5,000 words max. And my symposium for 5,000 words was the one that was accepted with the 750 word synopsis, and they let you expand it up to 8,000 words for the workshop. So that's where I got stuck, because I worked on that for a long time, basically up until the deadline. And I was trying to do, so I was already working with Descartes, Michael Della Rocca at Yale, one of his papers, and a pair of authors named Feldman and Connie, and they wrote a paper together, and I was using that to respond to Della Rocca. But there were a lot of other more specific things that I felt like I needed to bring in to fully answer the argument. One thing I was really certain I needed to bring in was Duns Scotus on the univocity of being, trying to think about our experience of evidentiary justification as an experience of God, and also trying to think about, he has this notion of univocity including the motion of being, or the being and flow, but also which is universal and singular and only is what it is. It's like the absolute truth or whatever, or the motion or the flow or the complexity, but it's like a dual univocity because there's also irreducible simples. And so I was trying to argue that phenomena, which are the justification for the Cartesian circle, the clarity and distinctness of the idea itself, the noetic phenomena is an irreducible simple, and there are different irreducible simples that correspond in virtuality. And that's the thing, is that it's essentially one, and it's basically hylomorphism, I guess, or Sicilian hylomorphism. It's essentially one whole being, but all of its different manifestations and how we can talk about it and translate between our perceptions and how it can cohere with all these differences comes down to a virtual univocity of irreducible symbols. And so this was, I was seeing this also as the crossover to language and the move from perceptual justification to propositional justification or sentential justification or categorical justification, so where you could go from a present claim to systems of claims like mathematics and science. And I think that is what Descartes does through the Cartesian circle. He goes from immediately knowing with his own conviction that something is true to being able to string together all these convictions to create systems of coherence and truth. And so it's not a circle proper because the first kind of clarity and distinctness is not the same as the kind of clarity and distinctness you get after God. When God guarantees clarity and distinctness, you get like the sentence that clarity and distinctness, you get the more propositional view. And I'm not even sure you should even go there after God. So yeah, I mean, the other issue at stake here is that there's a distinction between ad hoc deception and natural deception. And there's a close reading of the first meditation that sees the evil deceiver in Descartes not as the third reason for doubt, which is what everybody always thinks it is. And I've made lectures on this already. That's another good point. I mean, there's an entire lecture series in my 1301 class about the first three meditations that it provides this reading. But anyway, that first reading where the evil deceiver is a rhetorical device for all of the doubts together, not really a way of tricking Descartes or the meditator's own prejudices. Instead of something that does like argumentative work in the third or at the third point for the most fundamental types of doubt, like mathematical truths or geometric truths, like a triangle has three sides, 2 + 3 = 5. Instead, there's a close argument where Descartes goes, if God exists, then such and such and such, and I can be wrong about everything. And I can explain what that is in a second. And then he also goes, but if God doesn't exist, then I can also go wrong about everything because of such and such and such. And so he shows that no matter whether God exists or not, it's possible that he naturally goes wrong, right? Like God doesn't have to actively deceive him for him to go wrong. And that's his argument, is that it's not a contradiction of God's goodness for me to go wrong in small ways. And so for me to go wrong in bigger ways, more consistently all the time, it should also not be a contradiction of God's goodness. And I think he's right. I think that if we can be wrong, if we can have to learn things from childhood and make mistakes, which we do, and we don't think that that means that God is evil, then I don't really understand why me being wrong all the time would be evil. Now, it would seem evil if God was the one actually deceiving me. But God could have made me of a nature, or could have, the world and God could be of such a way, not of necessity that limits God's power, and not out of malice that limits God's goodness, but could be in such a way that I am able to go wrong all the way and all the time. And God could still be good, because God's not the one actively doing it. This argument would probably be contradicted or problematized by Philippa Foot's doing versus allowing. In doing versus allowing, Philippa Foot kind of responds to the trolley problem, which I think she also generated. But she's developing these these critiques of utilitarianism. Well, actually, I think she's developing critiques of deontology. But yeah, because the trolley problem and um, and doing versus allowing are both like instances where utilitarianism is just better, probably. In the trolley problem, you have to make an active choice that, and they're really similar, right? Because do you allow, like, some people would think that because they don't switch the lever onto the tracks, that they're not killing anyone. And if they switch the lever onto the tracks, between the tracks, to where the car doesn't go off the rails and the 6 people in the car don't die, but the one person tied to the track has to get run over. Or they're, something like that, right? Where you're sacrificing a life. You're exchanging a smaller number of lives for a larger number of lives. In doing versus allowing, Philippa Foot's looking at cases of abortion, and especially kind of, I think, stuck behind like Catholic doctrine, but she's also looking at legal doctrine, and she's specifically concerned about instances where the pregnancy cannot be terminated and both people will die, the mother and the fetus, or the child. It's not a fetus anymore. Let's say it's even a child. The mother and the child, or uh, the child can be terminated and the mother will be able to live. And you can get really confused and think that like not doing anything is morally right versus actively doing something like killing the child, having the abortion, whatever. But she puts pressure on that distinction for doing versus allowing to show that when you allow a bad thing to happen when you could have stopped it, it's probably just as bad as doing it yourself. And so if God allows me to go wrong all the time, we have to think very carefully about what kind of nature must be necessary, or what kind of creature I would be meant to be, that God could still be good and I could be made to grow freely. I could be designed to grow freely, which involves failure and success and free will. But then let's say God doesn't exist, and so because of that, Descartes argues, the meditator argues, that there's no absolute guarantee of my power or my capacity to become perfect, at least. Since Descartes believes that you cannot transfer, that when things are made by something else, whatever is made is only as perfect as what created it. Basically, there's never more perfection in the effect than in the cause. The effect the cause must contain at least as much perfection as the effect. This is important for his argument for God's existence, because our idea of God contains more perfection than our actual being could create, so we can't be the cause of it. It's a difficult and tricky argument in the third meditation for God's existence, but it is part of the Cartesian circle too, if you're giving a like really complete and careful reading of the whole picture. And yeah, so this argument between the case argument for God's existence actually comes to me from another philosopher that I'm not using their article yet, and so it would get even more messy. I've got, at that point, if I'm still trying to do Descartes too, I've got an introduction, Descartes, and then I've got Studhoff. Studhoff is one of the major translators of Descartes. And he's the one that wrote the article arguing for this specific reading of the first meditation, for the third reason of doubt not being the evil deceiver. Robert Studhoff, you commonly, the definitive collection of Descartes works, there are 3 volumes, and they're called the CSM. When you cite them, you write CSM 1 72 or CSM 2 this and that. He's like the authoritative voice, and he says that he thinks that it was mistranslated at certain moments and better translated more specifically to hold this argument carefully. And I really think that because Della Rocca, I didn't talk about the final section of his paper about the eternal truths, the doctrine of the creation of eternal truths and how that relates to God's power and if God could have made the world differently. But that also plays into why he views God, or why he views Descartes as an externalist, because he thinks that God's power is kind of like something beyond Descartes that Descartes submits to for justification. And part of the reason he does this is because he says that when there's the internal assent of clarity and distinctness, there is no checking in that clarity and distinctness in general is true. There's no second order proposition that justifies the claim. And that's, I think, one of the main misunderstandings about epistemic justification and mentally and internally, and why phenomenology, I think, does better. There's a noetic correlate that goes with every sentence we say. And whenever I'm trying to tell you something, I'm not having the language inside of me, but I am processing noetically what I want to tell you. Any sentence or statement works this way. And if you short circuit your brain to stop using language, you can just kind of flow with the noetics. Now, eidetic noetic means that there's the ability to noetically perceive an essence, an eidos, essence. Nous is mind or mental. And so, yeah, this is basically my argument that there's a mental correlate. And that's, Feldman and Connie argue for a mentalist variant of epistemic justification. And they say that there's no need, that one of the big misunderstandings in the critiques of internalism is the idea that you need to have something behind it, or some kind of deontological or doxastic legal universal principle like clarity and distinctness is always true. You don't need something like that. You can have the present evidentiary overwhelming conviction that something is true and it still be an internalist or mentalist justification. And in the first instance, before we have God and language, because if you really think about it, the cogito is not linguistic. Descartes is telling it to us, and that's the other thing that I think is really important, is that at the beginning of the second meditation, Descartes says, might there not be an evil deceiver who is putting into me all the thoughts that I am now having? And so he doesn't make it clear with that case argument for God's existence about going wrong all the time, but even the process of doubting itself through a linguistic reasoning, through anything other than the immediate perception of consciousness, anything mediated could be deceptive, or could be fallacious or wrong. I think that's what that word means. Sorry. He says, so you have to get behind language, and what you do is you go, oh, you kind of have like this, like, not a knee-jerk reaction, but there's this immediate sense of distancing yourself or doubting that and trying to look for something else. And if you search long enough, or if you have somebody help you, you can doubt that you're doubting. So then you're like, yeah, it should like kind of short circuit itself, to where you don't need language to prove that there's a contradiction happening in the perception itself. And that is the cogito. That recursive moment is the cogito, where perception flips back onto itself. This is what Sartre calls reflective perception. And most of the time, our perception is not reflective. It is what he calls non-reflective, obviously, right? But whenever I'm thinking about all of this and saying what I'm saying and looking around at this beautiful environment, I am not necessarily being reflective. I'm being somewhat, when I'm looking at the front thing and I can see the position of the frame, I have some sense of framing or posture or how I'm coming across or audience. But for the most part, it's still not reflective, because anyway. And the other thing is that by the end of the second meditation, you get that having sensory perceptions, imagination, doubting, assent, judgment, will, thinking, perception, and having sensory perceptions are all forms of thinking. And so in Merleau-Ponty, who's another phenomenologist, Sartre was a phenomenologist and an existentialist, Merleau-Ponty was a phenomenologist who emphasized the body. But the body is perceptual, it's constantly taking in information, and it's receptive. And this is part of the intentionality structure, the dual intentionality structure, where the world is also receptive. It is able to be changed. It is able to be formed and reformed, especially as one malleable thing. And I don't just mean like you can pick up rocks and move it. I mean like it could become something else. It is truly, solids can become fluids. Solids can become energy. Energy can turn back into mass. So thinking, therefore, is also a form of perception, and perception is a form of thinking. And that's, I guess, one way to kind of start bridging the gap where we're at. Because I think the main confusion is this demand for sentences or claims that you can check, formal logic systems. I took a formal logic class when I first started philosophy. It was my first class in philosophy. And I really liked it. And then my next semester, I took a class on modern philosophy, and I took a class on ancient philosophy. And in the modern class, we read Descartes first off, and I immediately tried to symbolize the existential instantiation of the cogito through like predicate logic. And it just wasn't cooking. It wasn't working. And it really wasn't what Descartes meant. So I think there's a way to carefully read the Meditations that is still a reading of Descartes, that isn't as contaminated by his other writings, where he assumed you like people. I just feel like every time I talk to somebody about Descartes, they bring in the canon without talking about the text itself. And I'm like, what if we all got it wrong? You know? So, yeah, that's basically like the thing that's important in the first meditation is that third reason for doubt being a case argument for natural deception. In the second meditation, we get that we can't trust language at all, and we get to sort of perceptions, and that thinking is a form of perception, and perception is a form of thinking. One of the examples Descartes gives is the wax changing form. It's lost all of its sensory identifiers, but we know that there's a continuity there that makes it still wax. So there's a judgment of continuity in our perception, which is necessarily mental or a form of thought. And the second example is the coats and hats outside that we judge to be men. We see them, we think, oh, those are men. Or we see men, immediately see men. He doesn't say, it's not a captain in a ship receiving reports, right? We don't think in a sentence, oh, those are men. We look at them and they're men wearing coats and hats. But Descartes says they could be automatons. Strictly speaking, the perception itself has no way of disclosing or conveying to us this information. There must be something mental. And the later phenomenologists will argue that this mental truth doesn't come from this mental disclosure, like Heidegger, I guess. The disclosure comes from the world itself, not from God or the soul or innate ideas. Descartes goes to innate ideas. Most people who are Cartesians and read and Descartes scholars go to innate ideas. And that's fair. Innate ideas are really helpful for trying to understand Kant's argument about the analytic and the synthetic a priori and a posteriori. Also, somebody was explaining to me that in Duns Scotus, a priori and a posteriori are not the same, don't mean the same thing. A priori is like the rational science, and a posteriori is like the empirical science. Or the political science, I think. I can't remember exactly. I do want to let you guys see this other side of this canyon, this little like crag we're in. It's maybe like 8 feet, 10 feet wide. Um, and we want to watch out for rattlesnakes and weasels. A lot of weasels around here. I'm probably loud enough that the rattlesnakes are not going to bother us. I'm being pretty mindful of it. I do have Winchester here. So, and then in the third meditation, we do get, we have the argument for God's existence. But Della Rocca points out that there are important moments where Descartes says that he can trust the clarity and distinctness of the cogito, and he can trust anything that is clearly and distinctly true. Let God try and deceive him. He can trust anything that is clearly and distinctly perceived as true, so long as he is perceiving it. But then when he's not perceiving it, and he explains this in like Letters to Berman, and Della Rocca does a really good job of basically proving that Descartes has normative certainty, not just psychological certainty, which could be epistemically unjustified, but you're like, oh, I'm inclined to believe this. Descartes has normative certainty prior to proving God's existence, but it's normative proto-linguistic certainty or perceptual certainty. I think it's best understood as a sort of evidentiary experience that overwhelmingly forms the conviction of assent. And this is what Descartes says, is he must assent to it when he perceives it. It's revealed by the natural light. There's clarity and distinctness, right? We should also think of this as, since there's no ad hoc deception or like after the fact deception from God, we should also think of this as, now remember, we may have said, oh, God's putting, the evil deceiver is putting in all of the words into my mind, but that was just a shorthand way of talking about the consequences of not having any grounds, whether or not God exists. If God exists, I could go wrong even with every single word. Doesn't mean what I think it means. Like, just jibber jabber. Whether God gave it to me or not, absolute rubbish. Can't trust it. That's, so we're not locked into reading the evil deceiver as the evil deceiver when we understand it to be, and he spends, the first meditation is 4 pages long, and he goes through 3 reasons for a doubt. He goes through the reason where he's at, the reason he's doing what he's doing, the 3 reasons for doubt. In between those reasons for doubt, he covers what each level of doubt he still can't doubt, what he's still very certain of, and what he still needs to find ways to doubt. And that leads him to the next doubt. And then he says, I can't doubt this and that. And that leads him to the third doubt. He goes through a lot of material in those 4 pages. And the entire last page is dedicated to like talking about his cultural prejudices and the long convictions of habit. He says, I cannot help but think that these propositions or these claims and beliefs, which are certainly doubtful, are, I'm not crazy, they're very likely still true. That's what he says. He's like, and I've lived with him for 40-something years, so I can't just like pretend. So let me think of an evil deceiver that is tricking me instead. And it's this like self-deception that he's doing to try to bring him to the limits of understanding and conviction, I guess. So he tells us it's this device, and that's no reason why in the immediate next page, when he starts to develop the cogito and he says the evil deceiver is putting the words into me, he just means everything is doubtful, including language itself. And if I'm going to doubt something, I need to do it not by reading somebody else's words, but by perceiving the doubt myself. By doubting that I'm doubting, oh, I'm something. Certainly this is something. Certainly the perception itself is something. I guess another thing I think is misunderstood about the meditations is that I think, therefore I am, the cogito is not a static occurrence, not a static ontological occurrence or thing or object, but is an ongoing process of the world and of myself in relation with the world. And the French, in some of the other places where he has this same claim, je pense donc je suis, which is the French version. Cogito ergo sum is the Latin version. Je pense donc je suis is, I think actually the one that he uses. Maybe not. Je pense donc je suis is the French is indeterminate between I think versus I am thinking, because the present conjugation, the present tense conjugation for all verbs at least as far as, I mean, there are other languages that do this, but I know that in French and in Spanish, I'm more familiar with Spanish, but in both languages, the present conjugation, like je suis can also be I am being, like I'm ongoing, or I am becoming. Becoming is more, I think there's probably a specific word for the birthing aspect of becoming, or the bringing forth aspect, or there are phrases that make that dimension of being more clear. But being, insofar as it's changing in dynamic in time and temporal, that probably is not something that Descartes he's a weird way of objectifying things that I don't think he needs to, because his occasionalism does seem to indicate that occasionalism is the idea that God recreates the universe from instant to instant, and there's no continuity from instant to instant. So there's just immediate successions of points that are recreated and held upright, so to speak, by God's power. This is why he says there's no such thing as being. There's no difference between being created and being maintained. And that's why the second argument for God's existence in the third meditation also allows him to have a third argument for God's existence. And those three arguments, I have the idea of God and I can study it, so God must exist. Something more powerful than me must have created me, so God must be my cause. And something more powerful than me must be maintaining me, so God must be my cause. They all correspond with Plato's analogy of the sun. The good, or the sun, is something that gives light so that we can see things, so that we can see like the grass and the trees growing. It's also the thing that gives energy and warmth to that grass and those trees growing, and we can study it as an object in its own right. All three things. Some people argue that Descartes is recreating Plato's cave. I forget who. I think we covered that in one of my undergrad classes. What else? So yeah, we have normative certainty prior to proving God's existence, but then when it comes to like proving God's existence, I think is when De La Rocca argues that Descartes is an externalist because he doesn't check in on what clarity distinctness actually means to prove God's existence. But the overwhelming, what it is that idea of God that we can study in its own right is as clear and distinct as our self-awareness, or our redoubled or our reflective perception of consciousness. It's also as self-evident as 2 + 3 = 5. So even the evil deceiver basically can't deceive us from knowing that God exists. This is the natural light, it's clear and distinct, etc., etc. But when we think about all these things as statements, like, oh, you're just defining the natural light as the most perfect thing, as a definition, that's fair. Now, I also do think that Descartes is an empiricist, or at least that he depends on mental experience, which must have a place, or at least must correspond with the world. The noetic experience, right? Because he says that I would not be able to trust that the clarity and distinctness if it ever proved that it had gone wrong, or and there are moments where he seems to say, like, I've had enough experiences with this to know that it's true mentally. So yeah, then it's all like clarity and distinctness, natural light. And I think the final piece of understanding this, there's no deceiver, there's no ad hoc deception, there's just this sort of like misalignment, misdharma our dharma is not with the world dharma. We're not harmonizing with the world. We're not, our perceptions are as good as they can be, are as justified as they can be. We are as justified in our perceptions as there is evidence for them mentally. That doesn't mean we're justified all the time. And that doesn't mean we have absolute access to total justification all the time if we just think about it the right way and we like are totally fallible then. But there's this ongoing process of refining the perceptions and refining the intuition and refining the justification, refining the eidetic noetic experiences through an intentionality structure, an openness in relation to a world that is constantly in perception of each other. And that means that they are accumulating more sensory data and expanding the set of phenomena that must be accounted for with a noetic. So that means that there's like an expanding noetic field. The expanding noetic field can then produce sufficient eidetic claims that correspond with the noetics or with the set of experiences that must be accounted for, including mental experiences. This is both scientific and philosophical. But it's a partaking of God insofar as God is this ultimate truth of reality. It's certainly what Cordova calls the Euroman way of thinking still. Because we assume a sort of universal language about the world. Maybe not necessarily. We can still move further away from that. But Descartes, as the first scientist and philosopher who, one, made the Cartesian plane, but also first scientist and philosopher who argued that the body and the world were purely mechanical and not influenced. They could be mechanical in the sense of being mathematizable and consistent with consistent principles. There's no magical spontaneity happening, according to Descartes. Now, we really come back against this when we get to quantum mechanics, because there does seem to be irreducible creative freedom and spontaneity in the nature of the world, where it cannot be predicted, it cannot be determined, and therefore that is what gives us ourselves a sort of liminality or degree of freedom and free will. But let's go back to the first two meditations. I mean, I think I've covered most of what I think my argument is. I don't think there's any way to get this into 8,000 words or 14,000 words for an article. But I think that De La Roca's second claim cut off for some reason. It's been doing that around like 45 minutes, 50 minutes. I don't know if the SD card gets overwhelmed or what. Maybe the GoPro runs out of processing power to like keep compiling that specific file. Like might not have enough working memory to keep cleaning up the stuff. Anyway, De La Roca's second, after De La Roca argues that Descartes is an externalist insofar as he doesn't need these propositional claims to justify God's existence through clarity and distinctness, because clarity and distinctness, but again, he's not seeing clarity and distinctness as a perceptual thing. He's still seeing it as a sentential justifier, a propositional justifier, a claim, a categorical justifier. All clear and distinct perceptions must be true, therefore I can trust the clarity and distinctness of this specific clear and distinct perception of God's existence. He's not doxastic. I mean, De La Roca is doxastic, and he expects Descartes to be doxastic, and my reading through Feldman and Connie's internalism is not doxastic. But because he expects internalism to be doxastic or to be legalistic or to have a sort of deontological underpinning that means that it is law-based or duty-based or is universally consistent and always accessible, because he expects internalism to do that, he then claims that it's externalist not to have that. But like I said, Feldman and Connie provide us with a definition of internalism where the redness of an apple may be sufficient justification for believing that the apple is red. And that's still an internal experience of the redness of the apple. And they go through a lot of cases where they say two people may have different experiences, but what will matter is the internalization of the different experiences that produce different, and they don't use the word noetic, but that produce different mental experiences, different noetic experiences that correspond to their degree of justification. This doesn't mean that Descartes is an externalist, it just means that he has a noetic experience of the cogito, of clear and distinct ideas as they're being presented, not linguistically, but just when he is reflectively focused on their clarity, distinctness, as well as the idea itself, but when he's focusing on the idea itself, whatever that claim is, that is clear and distinct. The clarity and distinctness is produced as a byproduct of the justification. And it's correlate always with true things. But viewing Descartes as an externalist corresponds with Descartes' principle of the doctrine of the creation of eternal truths and the claim that God could have made the universe differently than he did. And I think that you need other things like Duns Scotus mainly and the univocity of being to get out of some of these extra levels. And yeah, I don't know how to chop this up into smaller portions of paper because it seems like the specificity of the thing that I'm arguing for requires like 4 or 5 different nuanced frames kind of competing against each other to reveal the specific line. And without those frictions of all those voices against each other, the specifics of there wouldn't be enough texture in the text itself for the ideas to avoid misinterpretation. But so I could say it in a straight line, probably shorter, but then it would be prone to all of the misunderstandings that are common for Descartes. And to really get the really clear picture, it's certainly, I think it's more than 14,000 words, which is the major upper limit for an article. Right now, I think it's at like 9 or 10,000 words with some stuff on Duns Scotus. And yeah, I'm still workshopping it. I had to move, and I decided to take a break from it because I couldn't figure out how to work with that much information all at once. And like which order to present it in that would still make sense to people. Hey guys, check out this lizard. I don't want to run it off, but all right. So, there's that thing again. My colleagues that I spoke with at the workshop, they said it sounds like a really good paper. It sounds like it does enough work for an article. I guess it's like a kill your darlings moment. Like, where can I stop with one part of it? And knowing that it's not all the way right, not completely right. It needs more clarification, but I've got to get that first half published as an article before I can respond to it and try to continue cleaning things up. My only concern, though, is like whether or not the second half is necessary for justifying the full picture. And with abductive reasoning, so there's deduction, which is like this formal logical system where you use formal proofs. And then there's induction, which is where you inference to general patterns from discrete instances of particular phenomena. So I've got lots of cases of seeing chairs, so I know that chairs in general, I've lots of cases of I can sit on this chair, or I sat on this chair, therefore I can in future sit on this chair, right? Like you go from particular cases to general cases in induction. In deduction, you go from universal truths to particular cases. Deduction is considered 100% true and never wrong, as long as the facts it's discussing are also true in the world. And there are like specific terms for it: valid, cogent, sound, and I think the fourth one is strong. Winchester, come back. But I'm not teaching this. I'm not teaching a logic course right now. I can, but I'm not, and so I'm not brushed up on those terms. What I'm actually more interested in is a third type of logic that really rarely gets discussed, called abduction, which is it's not an inference, but it's the arrival at the perception of what best explains the data. So it's like you have a bunch of puzzle pieces, and you don't get a box with a picture on it, but you have the pieces, and they have to fit together, and they fit together the best when you put them like this. But everybody's kind of got them like that. They got them all spread out, all interesting and detailed, and like on their own they fit together the way they fit. But when you bring them back together to try to be more coherent, then I think my line of reasoning is more clear. But I just don't think it can be explained in an article. Maybe I could like get faster at restating other people's arguments in my writing. I tend to write in long sentences, and I tend to try to add lots of texture and detail along the way. We're getting close with the cutoff that happened. We're getting close to an hour, so I want to wrap this up probably. Let me make sure we covered my reading of the first three meditations. We covered Della Rocca's argument, mostly. We covered Feldman and Connie's argument about the main misreadings of internalism. Della Rocca wrote his argument, published his paper in 2005, and Feldman and Connie published theirs in 2001. I think that's worth mentioning. Not in the sense that Della Rocca should have been aware of the literature, but more in the sense that there's still combinatorial work that needs to happen across these different articles to get this full picture that we're talking about, or that I'm trying to talk about. Because his misunderstanding of internalism, where he says there is no checking in or checking up on the claim to make sure that clarity and distinctness in general must be true as a universal truth. There's just the immediate perception that clarity and distinctness is true, and he says this makes Descartes a kind of externalist at that moment, and I disagree completely. Maybe that's the first step. Maybe that's the shortest article, is just showing that it's not necessary that it be a form of externalism. And maybe in the conclusion I can talk about the other things that I want to argue at a later date. And see if that gets published. I guess there's three papers here. There's the one about internalism and externalism. There's the one about univocity and the move through language in the Cartesian circle, and that's through Duns Scotus. But it's also, it's just so closely related to my argument away from propositions. But the Feldman and Connie gives us that we can already do internalism without propositions. We don't need the deontological underpinning, or the deductive underpinning, we might call it. Yeah, because like internalism and externalism kind of roughly correspond with rationalism and empiricism. None of these terms are terms or debates that would have been relevant to the philosophers having them, and so none of them ever neatly fit in the categories. Locke is considered an empiricist and therefore probably also an externalist, and at some point he does think that you need like relations of ideas to string together your empirical perceptions. All right, guys. So they roughly correspond with internalism and externalism, roughly correspond with rationalism and empiricism, and that also roughly corresponds with deduction and induction. where rationalists think we have, or rationalists tend to have some form of innate ideas from which we can deduce other truths, and that's also a seeking of internal access to epistemological justification. And empiricists tend to be inductive about things, right? Like, you have all these phenomena, and then you can trust chairs in general, and you can trust tables in general, and rocks in general, and trees in general. Pragmatists kind of talk about abduction and what pragmatism means by William James. He mentions Peirce as talking about abduction. I'm not sure if Peirce, Charles Sanders Peirce, I'm not sure if Peirce meant it the same way that it means in the modern instance. But Dewey has abductive reasoning in his aesthetics, which he thinks every kind of intellectual conclusion is aesthetic. And he says that an intellectual conclusion arises at the same time that the premises arrive. You notice out of a set of information where some is relevant and some is not, you notice the few pieces that fit together in the right way elevate themselves out of the rest of the noise or the data. And so you don't start with propositions or premises and deduce or induce conclusions, but you abductively come to all of them at the same time from a confusing set of noise in the world of multiplicity. So yeah, these are some of the things we're thinking about. Trying to read Descartes, trying to be really charitable instead of like straw manning Descartes into all of these problems as like an internalist, or I'm not trying to destroy Descartes. I'm trying to show how he's not susceptible to some of the other issues that people claim by having a more nuanced reading of him. So, thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next one, guys. Hopefully we have enough time, but I'm going to try to walk down. Maybe like... My bag's right here, and I'm not going to necessarily grab it. But this is pretty cool. Some of this stuff is cool. And colorful. And you can see down into there too. And yeah, the lake down here, you guys. Whew. It's crazy. If you can manage camping, I recommend it. It's really cheap. Pretty cheap. Gas is kind of expensive right now, but the tent site is like $15 a night. So this isn't like some crazy expensive vacation, Anyway, that was more for the people that have been following along with the rest of the podcast. I want to thank Lone Star College Montgomery again for giving me the funding to attend the Pacific APA. I also want to thank the APA for putting on this event. It was beautiful. I was really grateful to my colleagues for working with me on the paper, and I was really interested in their papers too. One person had, I don't quite remember, but I'm sure I'll remember. And also it's probably best not to disclose other people's research while they're still working on it. The sessions are on the Pacific APA page for the next year, or the next 9 or 10 months or whatever, until the next a year from when they happened. They're made available, so you can always go back and register for the conference, and because it was virtual, everything is recorded, and you can go watch all of the events, all of the talks, and because I presented and got funding, I can go back and watch the other talks too. So I'm grateful for that. SPEP did something similar with their fall conference, so I need to go back and watch those before they go away this October. Thank you guys again, and y'all take care. Bye.